Nadia had been the AnotherKing's Luna for 3 years before she understood that a crown could be a cage. She had walked into that life at 22, young enough to believe that love and power were the same thing. Kale was everything the stories described: tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of winter storms, and a voice that made the floor vibrate when he spoke. He had chosen her from a gathering of 50 eligible women, pointed across the room, and said her name like he already owned it. She had taken that as a compliment. She had been wrong about many things at 22. The palace was beautiful, the way museums are beautiful: cold, perfect, and not meant to be touched. Nadia had her own wing, her own attendants, her own wardrobe full of dresses she had not selected. She had a seat at formal dinners, and a title that made older women bow their heads when she passed through the halls. What she did not have was conversation. She did not have warmth. She did not have a single morning where Kale looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he is genuinely glad to see. He was not cruel in obvious ways. He never raised his hand. He never raised his voice. Not at her. Not directly. What he did was simpler and more damaging than that. He looked through her. He answered her questions with one word. He made decisions about her schedule, her public appearances, her clothing, her travel, her friendships, all without consulting her, without informing her, sometimes without even remembering to tell her until the day before. When she pushed back, gently, with the careful language she had learned to use around him, he would look at her with a flat expression that said she was being difficult, that she was making something out of nothing, that she needed to understand how much he carried, how hard his position was, how little time he had for this. She learned to make herself small. She got very good at it. She stopped suggesting things. She stopped asking questions. She decorated her wing the way he approved of, and wore the dresses that had been selected, and showed up to functions, and stood at his left side, and smiled at the right moments. She became so good at performing the role that she sometimes forgot, in the middle of a state dinner, whether the woman smiling across the table at foreign dignitaries was her, or just the Luna of the Northern Pack, a title walking around in her body. The breaking did not happen loudly. It was a Tuesday in late November. Nothing was different about that Tuesday. The fireplaces were lit. The snow was coming down in the courtyard outside. She had made tea and brought it to the sitting room, where Kale was reviewing reports, thinking. She was not even sure what she was thinking, just that she had made 2 cups, not 1, and she sat across from him and waited. He did not look up. He read his reports for 40 minutes while her tea went cold. He left the room without a word. Not unkindly, not rudely, simply, as though she had not been there, as though the chair across from him were empty. She sat with her cold tea, and she thought about something very simple. She thought about her name, her real name, the one her mother had given her, the name she had been called for the first 22 years of her life, before she became the Luna, and everyone started calling her by her title, or by nothing at all. She could not remember the last time someone in this palace had used it. She honestly could not remember. She went to bed that night, and she lay in the dark for a long time. She left on a Wednesday morning before the palace woke up. She took a bag. She did not take the jewelry. She did not leave a note, because she could not think of anything to say that would matter. She walked out through the east entrance where the night guards changed shifts, through the gap of 7 minutes she had noticed over 2 years of sleepless early mornings, and she did not run. Running would have looked like fear. She walked, steady and even, all the way to the outer road, where she had quietly arranged a car 3 weeks earlier, with money she had been setting aside for 4 months from the household accounts she managed. She had been planning this without quite admitting to herself she was planning it. The car took her south. The southern territories belonged to the Kirin Pack, ruled by a king named Darian. She had met him exactly once, at a summit 2 years earlier. She remembered almost nothing about him, except that he had shaken her hand, and looked her in the eye, and asked what she thought about the border dispute being discussed. Not Kale, not the room, her. And she had been so startled by the question that she had fumbled her answer. She had thought about that moment more than she expected to in the years that followed. She arrived in the Kirin territory with very little. She found work through a placement service in the nearest town, the kind of administrative work she had been quietly doing for the palace for 3 years, without anyone framing it as a skill. She was organized. She was precise. She worked long hours without complaining. She rented a small room above a bakery, and she woke up every morning to the smell of bread and the absence of marble halls, and she felt, strangely, like she could breathe. She did not heal quickly. She wants to be honest about that part of the story. There were mornings in the first month where she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and felt such a specific and heavy sadness that it was almost like a physical weight pressing on her chest. Not grief for Kale, grief for the years, grief for the version of herself she had agreed to disappear. She cried about things that seemed small, a compliment from a colleague, someone holding a door, being thanked. She cried because small kindnesses still surprised her, and she did not like what that said about the years she had spent where kindness was rare enough to feel remarkable. She kept working. She got better at being surprised without crying. 6 months after she arrived, she was reassigned to manage supply logistics for the Kiran royal household. It was administrative work, not glamorous, and she was good at it. She was in the middle of a tense exchange with the head of household staff about a misrouted grain shipment when a man appeared in the doorway of the supply office. She recognized him immediately, older than she remembered, quieter in his presence, somehow, for a king. King Darien of the Kiran pack stood in the doorway of his own supply office in a plain gray shirt, arms crossed, watching her hold her ground against a man twice her size over a grain shipment manifest. When the exchange was finished, in her favor, he said her name, her real name, not her title, just her name. She flinched before she could stop herself, not from fear, from the strangeness of hearing it in a voice that was not her mother's. He noticed. He said nothing about it. He asked if she had a moment to review the full logistics report with him. She said yes. She sat across from him in his office and answered his questions, and he listened to all of them, not just the last sentence, and she left 40 minutes later, with the disorienting feeling that she had just been treated like someone whose thoughts were interesting. It built slowly, the way actual things do. He would pass her in the corridor and ask, genuinely, how the shipment situation had resolved. He invited her to sit in on planning meetings because, he said, she had caught 3 errors in the previous month's supply chain that his senior staff had missed. He asked what she thought. He waited for her to finish thinking before he responded. He disagreed with her sometimes, clearly, directly, without condescension, and he was right about half the time, and wrong the other half, and he admitted it when he was wrong with the ease of a man who had never needed to protect his ego at someone else's expense. She tested him. She was not proud of it, but she was honest about it. She pushed on things to find the edges. She was late to a meeting once to see what would happen. She challenged a decision he had already finalized, loudly, in front of his staff, expecting the flat look, the quiet punishment, the way a man with power teaches a woman her place. He looked at her with something between amusement and genuine interest and said, "You might be right. Let us revisit it tomorrow." She went home that evening and sat with that for a long time. She fell in love with him the way rivers find the ocean. Not rushing, not dramatically, just heading there, inevitably, by the path of least resistance, which for her turned out to be the path of being seen. He proposed on a Thursday afternoon in October. She had dirt on her boots from inspecting the southern perimeter warehouses. He had not planned it for a romantic moment, she suspected, because he was not the kind of man who valued performance over truth. He said he wanted her to stand beside him, not represent him, not compliment him, not decorate his court. Beside, an equal part of something they would build together. She said yes, with her muddy boots and her dusty jacket, and tears she refused to explain. The crown they placed on her head at the ceremony was lighter than the one she had worn in the north. Not physically, ceremonially. It was offered rather than assumed. She understood, for the first time, the difference. Then the news traveled north. Word reached the northern palace, her former home, her former cage, through the usual channels of pack gossip and political reporting. The former Luna of the northern pack, now the crowned queen of the Kiran territory, sitting beside a foreign king, wearing his crown. Kale arrived 2 months later, under the pretense of a diplomatic summit. Everyone in both kingdoms understood what it was. Nadia dressed that morning with care and quiet. Not for him. She was clear about that within herself. She had been working on being clear about things within herself for over a year now. She dressed with care, because she had learned that how you present yourself in a hard moment is a form of self-respect. She chose a deep green dress, her crown, and flat shoes she could stand in without shifting her weight. She was in the south courtyard when his convoy came through the gates. He looked the same. That was the strange thing. She had half expected him to look diminished somehow, the way people do in memory when they have hurt you, smaller, less significant than your fear of them. He did not look smaller. He was still the same tall, broad-shouldered man with the winter storm eyes. But something about the way she looked at him had changed, and that changed everything about what she saw. They met in the formal reception hall. Darian stood beside her, and the meeting was exactly what it was supposed to be on the surface: political, measured, polite. Afterwards, Cale asked to speak with her alone. Darian looked at her, not at him, and waited for her answer. She said yes. They walked in the East Garden, just the two of them. Cale spoke for a long time. He said she had been his greatest mistake. He said he had not understood what he had until it was gone. He said he still felt the bond between them, still felt the pull of it, and he believed that meant something, that fate did not make mistakes, that the connection they shared could not simply be erased by geography or a new crown. He said he wanted her to come home. She listened to all of it. She did not look away. She gave him the respect of her full attention, because she had grown, this past year, into a woman who could do difficult things without disappearing into them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She thought about cold tea. She thought about 40 minutes of reports, and a chair that might as well have been empty. She thought about the version of herself who had learned to make herself small, and gotten so good at it that she had nearly vanished entirely. She said, "I already am home." Not loudly, not with anger, not to wound him, though she accepted that it would. She said it the way a woman speaks when she has stopped being afraid of her own voice. Cale stood very still for a moment. Then he nodded once. He walked back through the garden alone. She stayed where she was. She watched the late afternoon light move across the garden stones. She heard, distantly, the sound of his convoy preparing to leave. She felt the bond mark on her wrist, that old persistent ache she had carried for 3 years, and then carried out the door, and then carried through the south. She noticed that it was quiet now, not suppressed, not numbed over. Quiet in the way that things go quiet when they have simply finished. Darian found her in the garden 20 minutes later. He sat beside her on the low stone bench without asking whether she wanted company, because he knew her well enough by now to know she would have said no and meant yes. He did not ask what had been said. He waited. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his chin on her hair. She thought about a Tuesday in November and a cold cup of tea. She thought about a Wednesday morning and the East Gate and 7 minutes and a car heading south. She thought about a narrow room above a bakery and the smell of bread and crying over small kindnesses. She thought about a man who had stood in a doorway and watched her argue about grain and then said her name. Just her name. She sat in the garden with her crown and her muddy boots king and the quiet mark on her wrist and the particular peace of a woman who walked through a fire and came out the other side, not unburned, not unchanged, but standing. Still standing. That was the whole story, really. She had left when leaving cost everything, and she had found out, on the other side of that cost, in the slow daily accumulation of being treated like someone worth knowing, that she had been worth it the whole time. The crown was never the point. It never is.